Let's focus on some international news now. And for months, we have seen the extreme measures taken in China to clamp down on rising COVID-19 cases. The protests against these measures have been growing, of course, in recent weeks. But now there are signs the government is starting to relent and ease those harsh lockdown measures. At the same time, China has demonstrated its support for Russia by continuing to trade with the country where others have boycotted over the invasion of Ukraine. Well, let's discuss these matters now with Steve Tsang, Director of the China Institute at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. Mr. Tsang, thank you so much for your time. So I think this is the question that most of us have when we look at China's position. Why has China clamped down so hard regarding COVID lockdowns when the rest of the world has been easing up?
Well, Xi Jinping said that the zero-COVID policy protected lives in China, and it demonstrates the superiority of the Chinese system compared to the democratic systems in the US or UK or in Europe. And therefore, it was difficult for him to not insist on the zero-COVID policy being sustained. And of course, that changed when protests happened.
Yeah. Does it say something about, though, that they perhaps don't trust the efficacy of their vaccines? Because what's happened in many other parts of the world is that the vaccines and natural acquired immunity have meant that we are much less vulnerable to COVID-19.
I think it's a slightly more complicated to that. They certainly were aware that Chinese vaccines were less effective than some Western vaccines, and they have been developing their own versions of the mRNA vaccines, but so far not quite getting there yet. There's also the issue of the health service system in China not being ready to cope with large number of infections and hospitalizations. And finally, the zero-COVID policy worked very effectively at the earlier stage of the pandemic. So they really thought that their system was superior. I think altogether they accounted for the very unusual approach they followed.
It's been really interesting to see how many Chinese citizens have just been getting so frustrated, though, with this draconian policy that they've been protesting, and eventually there has been a response from the Chinese government to relax some of the measures. Does that signal a changing relationship between the Chinese authorities and their citizens, perhaps one where they're starting to realize they need to listen more?
We would like to think it that way, but I don't think that reflects the reality on the ground in China yet. The protest about 10 days ago really changed everything when some protesters, starting in Shanghai, started to shout, "Down with Xi Jinping, down with the Communist Party." That posed a political challenge to the authority of both Xi Jinping and the Communist Party, and that really, more than anything else, changed the game for the Communist Party of China. What they have done since then is to repress all those protests. It's only after they have managed to repress all those protests did they start to change the zero-COVID policy in order to remove the causes for people to go out to protest against them. So in that sense, that relationship hasn't really changed. The party is still imposing its will on the people of China. The party has not said that they have changed because people were protesting against the zero-COVID policy. Zero-COVID policy as a policy officially still continues in China.
And talk to me more broadly about China's relationship with the rest of the world. We have seen that China is among the few countries that have not condemned Russia for its invasion of Ukraine. Does that inevitably mean that its relationship with other countries who have is going to be polarizing more and more? And do you see that getting to a critical point at any stage?
Not at this point. I think we have to bear in mind that under Xi Jinping, China's foreign policy effectively has a kind of China first principle. The government in Beijing thinks first and foremost about what is best for what they call Chinese national interests, which in reality means the interests of the Communist Party and its top leader, Xi Jinping. China's policy towards the Russian invasion of Ukraine has remained very consistent, if perhaps somewhat self-contradictory. And that policy is one of declaring neutrality, supporting Putin, and paying no price. Um, if we extend that into how China deals with the rest of the world, we have to bear in mind that first and foremost, China will be looking after China's interests first when it is engaging with countries in Africa or wherever they happen to be.
It's very interesting that, of course, if we look at how Africa stood, different countries took different positions regarding Ukraine. South Africa didn't vote to lambaste Russia over it, but other African countries did. Talk to me about the importance, in China's view, of Africa. How critical is Africa seen in China for development and economic expansion?
Well, Africa, or perhaps African countries, do figure significantly in China's foreign policy calculations. And the main reason here is that Xi Jinping is trying to change the way how the UN and other international organizations and agencies functioned, and being able to win the support of as many countries as possible for China's position is very helpful indeed. And one of the most obvious examples is how China is, in effect, capturing the Human Rights Council at the United Nations. And China has done so with the support of a significant number of countries in Africa, as indeed from some other continents. So yes, they do matter to China because their roles in international organizations and at the UN matters to China.
Thank you so much for chatting to us this evening. That's Steve Tsang, Director of the China Institute at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London.